If I could introduce our moderator for tonight, the Vice Chairman of our board, and a great Marine, former Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Central Command, General Joe Hoare. General Hoare.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Robert Kaplan.
Well, it's a great privilege and pleasure to be here at the Marine Memorial, a place I hold in very high esteem, to such an extent that I can tell you when people ask me what was the greatest professional privilege I ever had, it wasn't meeting presidents of the Secretary of State, it wasn't meeting a chairman of the Joint Chiefs, it wasn't even serving on the Defense Policy Board, which I'm very proud of. The greatest professional privilege I had was being an embedded reporter with the 1st Battalion of the 5th Marines during the first Battle of Fallujah in April 2004. I saw something both classical and ancient and modern. In other words, true warriors who ran into the bullets rather than away from them, and at the same time cried when a civilian was hit by the enemy. And nothing impressed me so much as the fortitude and just how 18 to 24-year-olds had the maturity of 60-year-olds. And that's what really struck me and moved me. Now, to get to what I'm discussing tonight, let me start off with the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, which destroyed completely the Portuguese capital. After the earthquake, sometime afterwards, the French philosopher Voltaire was reputed to have said that he was opposed to the earthquake. He was morally opposed to the earthquake. And Voltaire had a very specific object in mind, and it's Voltaire's opposition to the Lisbon earthquake that leads me to the book that I wrote. Because Voltaire's opposition was based on the fact that humanity should never give in to vast impersonal physical forces. That there was such a thing as human agency of overcoming the forces of geography and economics and others. That men and women had a responsibility before history to take actions which could lead to better or worse outcomes. And to just give up and say it's a matter of fate or geography or economics was the coward's way out. The problem with that is that it's something we should all aspire to, but policymakers, military commanders, and others have to live with facts. They have to live with the material at hand. They have to live with the fact that Taiwan is 100 miles off the coast of China, not 20 miles, like the width of the English Channel. And had it been 20 miles, the mainland probably would have conquered Taiwan back in the late 40s or the early 1950s. Policymakers have to live with the fact that they cannot change, that as long as Africa's coastline is, it still has fewer natural harbors and protected harbors than just the northeast coast of the United States. Policymakers have to live with the fact that the Carpathian Mountains still matter. They still divide Habsburg and Prussian Europe from the Ottoman Turkish Balkan Europe. And that means two different patterns of development, two different histories that matter today even in this currency crisis. We may live in a jet and information age where YouTube video could travel at the speed of light. And it's tempting to say that geography doesn't matter anymore, but the Hindu Kush is still a very important force in Afghanistan, separating the Pashtuns from the Tajiks and the Uzbeks. the Iraqi desert is still a very important force. Something with its waterless clear skies in the winter enabling air combat, and at the same time the mountains of Kurdistan allowing the Kurds a semblance of independence from the Mesopotamian Arabs down in the plains. These things matter. So what to do? How do you solve the conundrum, Voltaire's conundrum of not accepting the earthquake and at the same time accepting that these things matter? There's a great English professor of European history, Norman Davies, who said that history is made up of three things. It's made up of accident, of human agency, and of vast impersonal forces. Raymond Aron, the great French philosopher of the early and mid-20th century, said he believed in the truth of probabilistic determinism, which is fancy academic language for a modest acceptance of fate, but only a modest acceptance. Meaning that, yes, there are things like physical boundaries that do create limits and which you better respect, or else you will overstretch your country's resources and get into serious difficulties that your citizenry may never forgive you for. But within those broad parameters, there's enough room for policymakers to make right and wrong choices, which lead to better and worse outcomes. So that the real truth is, in order to overcome these vast impersonal forces, you first have to recognize what they are and recognize how formidable they are, because only by respecting them can you overcome them. And that's what this book is about. If you read the opinion pages, if you read the literary journals of opinion, both right and left, it doesn't matter, you will see every writer is concerned with what we can do, with what we should do. This book takes the other side of reality. It accepts those opinion pages, both right and left. But this book is about what they're not dealing with, which is what we cannot do, constraints. All foreign policy problems and challenges start with constraints. Once you recognize the constraints upon you, it's possible to forge a reasonable, responsible policy. So I've written a book on restraints, and written a book in the way that I'm not saying geography determines reality. I'm saying that geography adds a very forceful and powerful way to look at the world that gives you a new insight into reality without contradicting the other things. It's in that spirit that I wrote the book. Let me go around the world and explain what I mean. Let's take Tunisia, where the Arab Spring began in late December of 2010. It began in a town called Sidi Bouzid by a fruit and vegetable vendor who set himself on fire to protest his poor economic circumstances. Let's take a step back. Tunisia is the country in the Arab world closest to Europe. It's like a promontory sticking out, almost touching Sicily. It's only 8 hours by slow ferry from Tunis to Trapani in Sicily. For centuries, for most of history, in other words, it was integrally related to what we now think of as Italian history. Only in the last century has it become separate. In fact, I can tell you that the southern border of Europe is not the Mediterranean, it's the Sahara Desert. Because most North African Arabs don't live in the desert. They live along the Mediterranean coast. If you look at a demographic map of Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, everyone's clustered near the coast. And and they're actually part of Europe and will become much more, in fact, part of Europe now that authoritarian regimes have been toppled and the slow, circuitous march towards more modern societies develop. All right, so we have Tunisia, the most European of all Arab societies. But in the 2nd century BC, after the Roman general Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal, he dug a demarcation ditch, a fossa regia, which started at Tabarka on Tunisia's northern coast with the Mediterranean. It went down several hundred miles. Then it went eastward and ended at Sfax on Tunisia's eastern Mediterranean coast. Everywhere north of that ditch, the Romans built roads, and commerce developed, and development ensued. And it wasn't just the Romans, it was the Vandals, the Byzantines, the Ottoman Turks, and others, so that Tunisia today is extremely well developed within the demarcation ditch and the Mediterranean. Now, the town where that fruit and vegetable seller set himself alight in 2010 was south of that ditch, in the part of Tunisia that always suffered from unemployment, from underdevelopment, etc. So that we can say that the Arab Spring began in the most European of all Arab countries, the most easily susceptible to Western-style democracy with few, if any, ethnic disputes, a relatively flat landscape, easy to govern. But it started in the part of that country that since Roman times was always underdeveloped. Now that doesn't justify what happened. It doesn't completely explain it. It just adds another layer of understanding to it. And that's what geography does. Let's go to Libya. Let's compare Libya and Egypt. Egypt is an age-old cluster of civilization, like Tunisia. Tunisia, after all, is Greater Carthage. Egypt is, everyone lives within the Nile Valley. It's protected on the east and west by deserts. It's protected from invasion from the Mediterranean by the vast pan of the Nile Delta. Egypt has been invaded by Hyksos, by Persians, by Napoleon, but the number of those invasions are rare enough to constitute exceptions that prove the rule, that Egypt was protected. The Nile flows from south to north, enabling sea traffic, but the winds blow from north to south, enabling sailboats to go from the north to the south. So Egypt is an age-old polity that was always strongly governed because of geography, and therefore has strong institutions, strong bureaucracies, a real army, real police forces. The problems of Egypt are political. Governance itself is almost taken for granted. Libya is a different geography. Libya is was never so much a country as a vast geographical expression. Libya only connoted that vague part of North Africa between Greater Carthage and the Nile Valley. Northwestern Libya, Tripolitania, Tripoli, was always oriented towards Carthage and Tunisia. Northeastern Libya, Cyrenaica, Benghazi, was always oriented towards Alexandria in Egypt. So that Libya was always difficult to govern because it wasn't a geographical country to begin with. So therefore, it required a very extreme form of authoritarianism to hold it together. And when that extreme form of authoritarianism collapsed last year, it led to the formation of a government that could not govern beyond Greater Tripoli. Libya has had elections, but its elected government cannot project power beyond the capital very much. Again, this is geography explains not all of this, but it explains a good deal of it. Then you have Yemen, which again is the demographic core of the Arabian Peninsula, where most of the people live. Yemen's only a quarter of the size of Saudi Arabia, but it has just as many people almost. Yemen has been a node of civilization since antiquity, but it was never united. It always had at least half a dozen kingdoms: Hadramuti, Himyarati, Sabian, and others. And the Ottoman Turks, the British who controlled Yemen, were never able to penetrate into the center. They never had much control in the center. They governed from the coast, from the Red Sea and from the Indian Ocean coastline. Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was recently overthrown as the dictator of Yemen, held the country together barely for 30 years. Now that he is gone, it's again like Libya, it's barely a country, because it was never a country in history, divided as Yemen is by an infernal complexity of mountains and deserts. And to travel across Yemen, Yemen looks small on the map, but to travel across it takes days. The government only, even under Ali Abdullah Saleh, only controlled about 50% of it. At most. So again, geography explains much about Yemen. In fact, geography explains much about the United States. Before I move on to other parts of the world, let me say something about the United States. Americans think they're exceptional. They think they're better than other people. Americans happen to live in the last resource-rich swath of the temperate zone that was settled by Europeans at the time of the Enlightenment, that has more mileage of inland waterways than the rest of the world combined, and that these waterways flow conveniently southeast, northwest, northwest, southeast, thus uniting the continent. America has oceans on each side. To the north is the Canadian Arctic. Just north of the border is a tenth of the population of the United States, all middle class, all living within 100 miles of the US border. America's only real geographical challenge is to the south with Mexico, and I'll get to that later in the talk. But geography, we're an exceptional people, not just because of who we are, but where we happen to live. And now let me go around the world a bit and explain this further. Europe. Europe has been reduced to a financial story, where whenever you read a story about Europe, it's about debt replacements, interest rates, forgiving loans. If you don't have a PhD in economics, you can't follow what's going on in Europe. But in fact, the European story is much larger than that. It's a geopolitical story. It's a geographical story. Look at the map of the European Union. Where are the cities located? The great cities of the European Union. The capital, Brussels. The treaty town of Maastricht. The parliament town of Strasbourg, etc. They all lie along the line of the spinal column of old world civilization that is completely synonymous with Charlemagne's empire in the 9th century. And this is no accident that the European Union, where the decisions are made, are exactly the heart of Charlemagne's empire. Because this is the rich forest land, with forest clearings conveniently located where cities could take root, with very rich, lush soil, which provided for free agriculture, for free societies to develop, opposed to the poor, stony soils of the Mediterranean that required irrigation and enabled oligarchy. At the very top in the Low Countries, you have a cluster of naturally protected harbors whose shattered coast both protects it from the Atlantic and is open to the great sea lanes of the Atlantic. It's no accident that northwestern Europe became the cockpit of history from Charlemagne's time right up to the European Union. To the east, you have Germany. And Germany has natural borders in the north with the North and Baltic Seas, and in the south with the Alps and the Carpathians. But it has no natural borders to the east and west. So that Germany's size and shape on the map kept changing throughout history. And to the south, you have the Mediterranean. To the southeast, you have the Balkans. In the north, you had the Prussian Empire. In the center, you had the Habsburg Austrian Catholic Empire. In the southeast, where the Balkans are, you had the poorer, less institutionally well-developed Ottoman Turkish Empire. All these different imperial legacies were legacies of geography and also created different economic and social and cultural development patterns. And so the attempt to unify them all under a single currency in 2002 was a very ambitious undertaking. In fact, so important is geography, let me tell you, that when the Warsaw Pact collapsed in 1990 or thereabouts, and if you looked at a map, you could predict how each former Warsaw Pact country would do economically over the next decade, under the first decade of independence from the Soviet Union, merely by its cartographic position. Poland, part of the Prussian Empire, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, all did the best, all those countries in the north. Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and the central and southern parts of the former Yugoslavia, all parts of the former Ottoman Turkish Empire, either fell into political paralysis like Romania, into periodic anarchy like Bulgaria and Albania, or into outright war like 2/3 of the former Yugoslavia. The two countries of the former Yugoslavia that have done the best in the last decade, both economically, socially, in terms of quality of life, Slovenia and Croatia were both part of Habsburg Austria, and which in turn was a creature of geography. So that while we're all reading about a financial crisis, geopolitics is not ended. Because while Europe is now enwrapped in its own problems, the specter of Russia to the east looms. The Warsaw Pact may have collapsed, but Russia is still a force to reckon with to the east. Russia supplies Central and Eastern Europe with natural gas, giving it a lot of leverage. And that natural gas also puts a lot of money into the hands of Russia. Over $1 billion, several $100 billion to spend, almost $1 trillion actually, in saved revenues. And this natural gas is a creature of geography in Central and Eastern Siberia. And so while the European Union wallows in its troubles, the Russians are buying up everything from electricity grids to natural gas transport groups to other infrastructure throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Not creating the Warsaw Pact, but creating a new zone of influence. Europe has less financial bandwidth to aid countries like Serbia and the Ukraine, which is very convenient for Russia. Ukraine is mired in political paralysis, corruption, instability in the countryside. The Russians love this situation. So that the battle between Russia, and by the way, throughout all this, Germany has gotten much stronger. Berlin may not have all the answers, but Berlin is sort of the point of arbitration for all these issues in dealing with the EU debt crisis. NATO and the EU were supposed to keep the Germans down and the Russians out. It's done neither. We've come back to classical, geographically based geopolitics, with the Russians surging forward, Europe weak, and that band of buffer states from Estonia to Bulgaria up for grabs, in a sense. Let me talk for a minute or two about Russia. The West loves to hate Vladimir Putin. There's something about him that just enrages everyone. We should not be enraged about him. He's your normal, run-of-the-mill, autocratic Russian leader, much like the czars and the commissars before him. Putin's cynical neo-imperialism is the upshot of a deep, deep geographical insecurity. Putin knows that his natural gas is going to be challenged by the United States in a decade, because the United States, again for reasons of geography, has vast resources of newly discovered shale and shale gas, which Texas conglomerates will be exporting to Europe in about a decade. Putin knows that his country covers half the longitudes of the earth, but with a population smaller than Bangladesh, and a population getting smaller every decade because of low quality of life and other resources, other issues. Putin knows that unlike the United States, the rivers of Russia flow north to south and thus divide the country rather than unite it. So Russia is very vulnerable. It has very few good natural frontiers on its borders. So Putin is obsessed with recreating buffer zones in the Baltic states, in Poland, in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia. And the Poles of all people, Poland, live geography. They understand this new old geopolitics coming back in Europe. That's why while European defense budgets are declining, Polish defense budgets are increasing. And Poland is well placed to be the pivot state of Eastern Europe if the Russians are able to retake in de facto form Ukraine. Let me move on to China for a moment or two. China has two big geographical facts, one positive, one negative. The positive geographical fact of China is that China is much bigger than it looks on the map. China is set to expand, not through troop movements, but virtually through corporate takeovers, migration, and others, into the Russian Far East, into former Soviet Central Asia, into Southeast Asia. The Russian Far East only has 7 million people, and the population is going down to 4.5 million people. To contrast that with 100 million Chinese in Manchuria. The Russian Far East has the timber, diamonds, and gold that China covets. China is poised to expand into outer Mongolia, which had been part of China under the Qing dynasty 200 years ago. China again, Mongolia again has a lot of the minerals, strategic metals, the grasslands, all of which China covets, and Mongolia has only 2 million people, while there are hundreds of millions of Chinese poised at the border. Central Asia, the Chinese are building oil pipelines, natural gas pipelines, flooding the area with goods and loans, basically stealing Central Asia from Putin. Remember, Putin and China can have tactical alliances, but they can't have a strategic alliance because Russia is threatened by Chinese geography. And in Southeast Asia, Thailand, which was a Western bulwark for decades, is weakening as a state, enabling Chinese incursions, economic and political incursions into the area. So this is all good for China. But here's the bad part about China. Ethnic Han Chinese live in the center of China and along the Pacific coast. Surrounding them on 3 sides, within China's borders, in the upland plateaus, are ethnic Inner Mongolians, ethnic Uyghur Turkic Muslims, and ethnic Tibetans. And where the minorities live is also where all the water resources are for China. And it's also where 80% of the coal is for China, as well as other natural resources. So when Americans lecture Chinese leaders about the need to democratize and open up their system, the Chinese leaders know how naive these Americans are, because the Chinese leaders understand that a more open system not only leads to more individual rights, but it leads to ethnic self-awareness and ethnic rights, so that there's probably no way China can liberalize without stirring up, ethnic nationalism in Tibet, in Xinjiang province where the Uyghur Turks live, and in Inner Mongolia. And just a word about Tibet. The Dali Lama is a geopolitical, geographical figure. He's kind of like Pope John Paul II, who is Polish, who therefore affected European geopolitics. The Dalai Lama sits on the land, Tibet, which has all the water resources, not just for China, but for Bangladesh and Northeast India as well. It's like the water capital of the world. And the Dalai Lama is very astute, very moderate. Whoever comes after him from the Indian exile community in Tibet is probably going to become more radical. We're seeing more self-immolations by Tibetans each year. The Tibetan movement is about to fracture and become more radicalized at the same time. Tibet will be a great geopolitical issue in the future because of geography. A word about the South China Sea, the East Sea. Why are we seeing all these struggles over bare rocks in the ocean? They're not even islands, they're features, because during high tide they're underwater. What is going on here? What is going on is that finally, after decades and centuries in the case of China, Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines have all constituted themselves as strong states with strong bureaucracies and institutions, which for decades and centuries they were not. Vietnam was caught up with an internal war, so was Malaysia with the Huk Rebellion, so was the Philippines with its Muslim and communist rebellions, so was China with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Japan was in a quasi-pacifistic shell for decades. That's all in the past now. Now we have really vibrant societies that have the possibility to develop strong navies and air forces. So they are finally projecting power outwards, and that leads to territorial disputes in the maritime sphere. These disputes are not about ideas, they're not about philosophy or ideology, they're about space on the map and about the natural resources that may lie beneath that space. And there's no getting away from it. It will continue because nationalism may be passé in parts of Europe, but nationalism is alive and well in East Asia. Two final points. I'll touch a bit on the Middle East and then end up with Mexico. The Middle East has a number of natural features. There's the Anatolian Plateau, which is synonymous with the country of Turkey. And Turkey also holds the major water resources for the Middle East, the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates. Turkey is an emerging middle-level power, sort of a zone of stability surrounded by relative anarchy. On top of mountain fortress, it projects power into the Balkans, into the Caucasus, and into the Middle East. The Arabian Peninsula is not synonymous with any particular country. Saudi Arabia is an artificial contrivance of a family rule covering part of the Arabian Peninsula, not all of it. Its aging Brezhnevite leaders have to deal with a male youth population, 40% of which is unemployed, is roiling because of a toxic combination of social media and unemployment, and is on a diminishing water table. Probably the most natural geographic feature in the whole Middle East is the Iranian Plateau. And the Iranian state is synonymous with the Iranian Plateau. And that makes it heir to great Iranian civilizations going back to early antiquity. The Medes, the Parthians, the Achaemenids, the Sassanids, the Qajars, and others, and lately the Ayatollahs. There's nothing artificial about Iran. Saudi Arabia could crumble, Syria could crumble. Syria is another vague geographical expression that harbors a number of ethnic and sectarian groups, regionally based, rooted in geography, that for decades used a virulent anti-Israel, pan-Arab ideology to assuage its sectarian differences within, but which can no longer be assuaged. But Iran is a real country. Its regime could be overthrown. Its regime could weaken. Its regime could transform itself, but there will always be a strong Iranian state. And keep in mind, the United States has been estranged from this Iranian state for 33 years now, a third of its century. The U.S. was only estranged from Red China. Remember, Red China was estranged from Red China for a quarter of a century, from 1948 to 1972. So at some point in the future, maybe through peace or maybe through another war, the United States will ultimately have a rapprochement with Iran, because Iran is the major geographic factor in the Middle East that the United States cannot get away from. I'm running over time. Let me just talk about Mexico for a few minutes. As I said earlier in my talk, the United States is geographically blessed. It has more or less natural borders. The only exception is Mexico to the south. Half of the border is artificial. The United States has an aging society. The average American is 37. Mexico is a young society. The average Mexican is 25. The average Guatemalan and the average Honduran is 20. So it's a much younger, south of the border is younger, and therefore populations south of the border are growing at a much greater rate than the American population in terms of size. Mexico is already a third the population of the U.S., and that distance will close as the years and the decades move on. Mexico is a very vibrant economy. It's one of the world's 15 largest economies. It's climbing up in that rank. It grew by 4% last year, which is an amazing figure considering we're in the teeth of a global recession. And Mexico's a developed economy. The northern Mexico, though, is dominated to a significant extent by criminal drug cartels. So much so that since 2006, 50,000 Mexicans have died in violence in the northern part of Mexico, close to the U.S. border. That's 2.5 times as many Syrians who have been killed over the last 18 months. It's 10 times as many Americans who have been killed in Iraq. And yes, the rate of violence has gone down over the past few months, but that's only because the drug cartels are now finally consolidating their rule in northern Mexico. So Latin history is moving north into the United States. And the kind of society Mexico ultimately evolves into will say much more about the kind of society America becomes than anything that is likely to happen in Afghanistan or Iraq. Because in the southwestern United States, I think 90% of the major towns are Hispanic-speaking, or mostly Hispanic-speaking. There are some exceptions. We're seeing a new country come into being, though undeclared and unofficial. One geographer called it the República del Norte, consisting of the southwestern United States and the northern third of Mexico, where U.S. currency is the currency of choice, etc. So that America's destiny may be more north-south than east-west in the future, extending from Mexico City up into Canada. And so geography will still help have a great effect on where we become. But there is enough room within the parameters that I've laid out in this talk for better and worse policy decisions to be made that will ultimately be the final determinants of what we become in the future. Thank you so much.
Several people have asked to talk a little bit about the Israeli problem, and more specifically with respect to Israel and Iran.
Okay. First of all, Israel is a small country surrounded by enemies, half a world away. The United States is a big country, mainly surrounded by friends and open seas. Our geographical situations are so vastly different that our interests cannot overlap completely in every single situation. They overlap substantially for two reasons. One, Israel is a democracy and has a stable government. The other is that the U.S. has supported Israel so vigorously and for so many decades that were Israel to be fundamentally threatened, it would probably undermine America's own reputation for power in the region. But that doesn't mean that we have the same red lines. Exactly. That doesn't mean that we are as threatened by Iranian nuclear weapons as Israel is threatened by nuclear weapons. And that different degree of threat leads to different foreign policies. And it leads to policy, of fights and arguments and tensions between Washington and Tel Aviv.
Several of our friends tonight have been interested in access to water. That is certainly a big problem in the Asian subcontinent. What are the consequences there and elsewhere?
Yes. In West Bengal in India, Bihar in India, Assam in India, Bangladesh, which is geographically East Bengal, all depend on water from Tibet. And China wants to dam up these waters. India wants to dam them up so that Bangladesh is in danger from two ways. It's in danger of drought from the north because the water is being dammed up in India and China and is not flowing down. And it's endangered by rising sea levels from the south, which on the Indian Ocean in the Bay of Bengal, which leads to more alkalinity in the soil and kills crops. So Bangladesh is the most endangered country in this regard. Chinese and many Indian cities, Calcutta's an exception, have a real severe problem with fresh water. Water is going to be the issue of the 21st century.
Was the economic decision about what was available in terms of resources was made before the countries concerned divided up the property?
Yeah. Yes, and it gets very personal and very hot-blooded. I was in the Philippines over the summer, and the Philippines is a poor country. It's not like the rest of Asia. And the Filipinos believe that this oil and natural gas underneath the Spratlys, around the Spratlys, are theirs. It's going to make them rich. And they're not going to let the Chinese take it from them. And they, as you know, they ejected the United States from Clark Airfield and Subic Bay Naval Station in the early 90s. But now they desperately want the United States Navy and Air Force back as a balancer against China. Because what happened between the early 90s and now? What happened was that China built a great Navy and Air Force. And is able to project power outward, and the Chinese are claiming virtually the entire South China Sea as their own. And they won't give in on this. And in Beijing, I met a lot of intellectuals, think tank people, university professors who were all open-minded, open to a compromise, but they all said the nationalistic elements are such that there's no way the party can back down. And if China enters a period of tumultuous political transition, these periods will only lead to more nationalist policies because each faction will try to outdo the other in terms of its patriotic bona fides. So that Also, the problems of the South China Sea, at least, the legal issues are so contentious and so complicated, nobody I spoke to believes that they'll be settled. They believe it's just, there'll be bad periods, there'll be better periods, there'll be a lot of posturing. It's like a fight for king of the hill status in a global media environment. That's, all this tit-for-tat maneuvering of warships. I don't see any solution except all these countries, especially Vietnam, want to draw the UN and the US in more to balance against China. Vietnam's rebuilding Cam Ranh Bay, dredging it, because they want more US warships. They whisper sweet nothings into the ears of American officials. They want more American fighter jets at Tan Son Nhut airfield. This is what they want. As someone explained to me, it's not because they love America, it's because they need America to balance against China.
It's interesting that it seemed to me that when we assured the Philippines that we would back them up in any problem in the South China Sea, we were opening the door to very serious potential problems.
Yes, the United States has to steer between two parameters. On the one hand, we cannot let the Chinese dominate the South China Sea, because then we've totally sold out our treaty allies and others, and leads to a great imbalance of power. On the other hand, we cannot let countries like the Philippines and Vietnam drag us into a conflict with China, because we have many other equities with China that go way beyond the South China Sea.
One of our guests cited Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations and wondered how you would contrast that with your own book.
The Clash of Civilizations, it's interesting. Everyone hated the title. They hated the idea of a clash of civilizations, but that's not exactly what Huntington wrote. What he was really writing about, when you see his book and you read his book, was about the decline of the West. And the decline of the West was very gradual. And there would be various stages to it. And one would be globalization. But globalization would lead to a rise of ethnic and cultural consciousness, because suddenly the Islamic world would be united by mass media, so that Indonesians can demonstrate in favor of Palestine 6,000 miles away. So that globalization would lead to rising what he called Islamic consciousness and cynic or Chinese assertiveness. And that combined with Western arrogance would create the clash of civilizations that would be part of the demographic and economic gradual decline of the West. Considering that he wrote this in the early 1990s, he's proved remarkably clairvoyant, I would say. And it's actually a very nuanced book. I recommend that all of you to read it. I'm a great admirer of Huntington. I think he was a great, Huntington was a Democrat all his life. People accused him of being this retrograde right-winger when his theory came out, but actually he was a Democrat all his life. He met his wife during the Adlai Stevenson campaign in 1956. And he basically believed in a kind of centrist realist foreign policy. And realism, Huntington's realism, just to end here, is never much respected except when things go wrong. When things go wrong and we realize, we respect realism because we've just experienced the demonstrable lack of it.
I think this is going to be the last question, and it concerns Joe Nye's concept of soft power and how this squares with the geographic construct.
Well, Joe Nye's concept is obviously not geographical. He's writing about power as the power to persuade, which becomes more relevant in in an electronic communications media environment, which didn't exist in earlier decades and centuries of history, where the power to persuade was limited to behind-the-scenes diplomacy of the kind that Metternich and Castlereagh and others engaged in. But now the power to persuade is public, it's global, so that there's such a thing as public diplomacy. Whereas in 19th century Europe, the term public diplomacy, the concept didn't exist. It had no meaning. So that's what Joe Nye is writing about. And as far as it goes, he's correct. And there's no conflict with anything that I'm writing about. As I said, he's writing about the part of reality that the opinion pages are dealing with. You know, the eternal debate over what policy should be pursued. And what I'm doing is I'm writing about the physical constraints.
Robert, I'm afraid we've come to the end of this whole program. I want to thank the Marines Memorial Association and the World Affairs Council for sponsoring this, for this excellent talk. I want to be sure to point out to all of you that Robert is going to be here, and we've got about a gross of books over there, so you have a good opportunity to buy them and get Robert to sign off on them. I think you'll all agree that this has been an extraordinarily instructive evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.